take a second to welcome everyone to this month's Malcolm X Talk on marijuana legalization and reparations. That's going to be led by our Director of Research, Lawrence Graham Free. For those of you who are not familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we are a grassroots think tank that advances the public policy interests of Black folks in Baltimore. We sort of have 4 areas of focus. The first is autonomous intellectual innovations, which basically means we write books and create intellectual works for the public. The second is youth development, which we achieve through our annual Debate and Leadership Institute called the Eddie Conway Liberation Institute. The third is arts and culture, which is my specialty as the resident artist. But basically, we use art as an organizing tool, as a means to connect with the community, and sort of a way to take our more lofty ideas and make them more palatable and accessible to everyday folk. And then the last is political advocacy, which basically means we support existing and emerging policy and advocacy interests, as well as create a foundation for more radical policy changes. And so again, thank you so much for coming out. That's us in a nutshell. Today, we're going to be discussing the current environment and future environment around cannabis entrepreneurship in Maryland and our advocacy to use tax revenue generated by marijuana legalization to fund reparations for the war on drugs. So what's going to happen is Lawrence Graham Free is going to do a presentation. I'm going to come back to facilitate Q&A, and that's how we're going to do it tonight. So without further ado, give Lawrence Graham Free a
Thank you, Breon. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So I'm going to try to talk for not more than an hour, definitely. Try to keep it around 45 minutes. Got a few slides here. Just so we can be more clear, LBF calls us a grassroots think tank, started on campus at Towson University. But in 2010, we went off campus where our former debaters who wanted to use the skills we got from debate to actually help the community. So ever since 2010, we've been in the Baltimore community doing policy advocacy and essentially lobbying. But our client is essentially you all, the people. We're not a nonprofit. We're funded through direct contributions from folks like you, which allows us to put a lot of leverage on lawmakers because we get to call them out to their constituencies. And unlike a lot of other nonprofits, we can say, do not vote for this person. So what I'm saying here is I'm relaying to you all what we've been relaying to lawmakers in Annapolis, right? Because the idea is that this legalization train is coming, despite what we currently have in the White House. And for a few years now, I've been kind of really, I guess like a lot of people, thinking really hard about just all the decades of violence and trauma that Black communities have faced from the war on drugs, and not wanting to see, some people call it a green rush, like a gold rush instead of with marijuana. This green rush for all these white entrepreneurs and all of these powerful interests making money off of marijuana, be it the tax revenue that flows through Annapolis, or the profit that flows through first medicinal marijuana, which we just got in the state a month ago, and what I believe will be quite soon legalize recreational marijuana. Right. So the idea is to show you our theory behind this, how this works, give you some history, some background, and walk you through the policy proposal that we have. This is based upon a little bit of what some other states have done, California, Massachusetts, things like that, but this is really something where Maryland's going to have to innovate. I think that being a think tank, we see policy as a space to really do some emancipatory work through the policy framework. So, but first we need some history. So, sound's not going to be great because we do have the sound speaker from the projector. Hopefully it'll be good enough for you to hear what's going on and hear some of the dialogue. But I wanted to show you a little clip of this movie because it gives you some historical context on what we're going to be talking about. classic film, Reefer Madness, came out in 1936. Some other names for it was The Burning Question, Dope Addict, Dope Youth, and Love Madness, right? And this is a 2-minute trailer, and it says things like, beware of the burning weed from hell, right? This is obviously anti-marijuana propaganda. But the idea that I want to try to present you all with is that this is a very important time, the 1930s. Previous to this, you know, you probably remember the commercials where it's like opium, it cures what ails you, right? All types of drugs were legal and used for medicinal purposes. So what is happening here in 1930s for that began to shift? Also, I wanted to show this to kind of point out the woman playing the piano, the woman jumping from the window. This is a specifically racialized threat. That something can happen to our American archetypes of whiteness, youth, and beauty that can corrupt them. And of course, that makes it so you have to think about where even the term marijuana comes from. I mean, some of you probably know the medical term for it's cannabis. So why do we use the term marijuana? Anybody know who this guy is?
Pancho Villa.
Speak up.
Pancho Villa.
Pancho Villa, yes. Pancho Villa was a Mexican freedom fighter against the sort of neo-colonial regime they had there, but eventually, because of some fallouts he had with who would take over the country in Mexico, between the U.S. supporting a different regime, he kind of turned into what we call a terrorist, right? So, Pancho Villa comes into the story because he actually had some raids on New Mexico, what is today New Mexico. And he actually basically took over hundreds of thousands of acres of land that belonged to American business people. So this Mexican struggle for liberation, in addition to, it's not going to that speaker. It's going right now. Yeah. Okay. You mean for the voice? Okay. No, yeah. So the Mexican struggle for liberation combined with business interests in America. So obviously when you take almost 1 million acres of land that belong to American business people, they're not going to like that, right? And you have this increased immigration into Mexico. Obviously there have been what we call Mexicans in America, as long as there's been America. A big chunk of what we call America used to be Mexico. But an increased conception of a racialized threat began to get more popular media coverage during this time. So, many of you may not know who this guy is. This is Henry Anslinger. He was the first leader of what basically became the DEA, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Very ambitious civil servant, big into prohibition. And he was really someone who advanced an anti-marijuana agenda. So he combined with this guy. Anybody know who this guy is? I think we got it right here. William Randolph Hearst. That name may sound familiar. He was a huge media mogul in the 1930s. Part of the land that was nationalized in Mexico was his land. And that was a confluence of basically racism and economics that produces marijuana prohibition in America, right? So Hearst is connected to, well, first of all, he likes to sell papers. And stories of a racialized threat, like sells papers. Specifically a racialized threat through the lens of insanity, or through the lens of being under the influence of a drug that makes you insane, that makes you a threat to whiteness, white virtue, white women. So Hearst, seeing folks like Pancho Villa as an economic threat, and just generally liking whiteness, begins to use racialized depictions of high Mexicans committing crime as a trope to sell papers. But also, many people say, it is a larger vision of economics. So, I didn't have a slide for this, but I probably should have. So, what we smoke with cannabis is the buds, like the budding flowers. The actual, most of the plant isn't smoked. And there are certain variations of the plant that are high in THC. Most of you know that's a psychoactive chemical in cannabis. But the actual pulp, the fiber, has been used in industry for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And that's obviously, well, not obviously, that's called hemp. So when you think of a ship in the 1800s, the rope on the ship was like native hemp. And you could cultivate industrial hemp for all types of purposes all over the country. And DuPont, chemical company, basically produced a synthetic alternative to hemp, which you all probably know, called nylon. So it was seen as in the interest of folks like DuPont to use an attack on marijuana as a way to demonize hemp, right? So you really had this confluence. It's not just economics, like, you know, a neo-Marxist interpretation we're having here. It's a very deeply racialized threat that produces the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which actually federally prohibits the use of marijuana. But it's an increasingly racialized interpretation of what drugs are, what they do, and how it ties to policing that brought us to the current day. A little bit more, name this person. All right. Patty Hearst. Yes. Many, especially for folks who are a little bit older, probably know who this is. She's the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, born in 1954, 1970s. She's gallivanting around Berkeley, California, and she kind of gets kidnapped, right? There's this, maybe if you don't know the story, okay. There's this radical group, not really like a black nationalist group, though some people depict it that way. It's kind of a ragtag group of wannabe revolutionaries called the Symbionese Liberation Army. And they kidnapped and supposedly brainwashed Patty Hearst to the point where she becomes a symbol of their propaganda. Rich heiress in Berkeley in the 70s, being seen as being indoctrinated into radical ideology to the point where she is caught on tape wielding machine gun robbing banks, right? So this was a really, really big story in the 70s. Could be a bigger story when it actually ends, right? So this is the raid by the LAPD on the FLA. This is important because this is one of the first times that the SWAT team comes into national consciousness, right? So what I argue is that we have a racialized frame for policing, and we have a turn in the 1970s towards an increasingly militarized thinking around how we engage policing that spills over to drugs. That's important to understand the drug war. It's important to understand who this guy is. This guy is Daryl Gates. He is the leader of the LAPD. He is not the person who invented the SWAT team, but he's the person who popularized it, created a series for it. In '65, there was a huge race riot in Watts, South Central Los Angeles. He basically felt like the cops almost got outgunned by the rioters. So ever since then, policing has been framed through a lens of racialized threat and being able to respond to what is an increasingly perceived racialized threat. And the SLA and Patty Hearst just adds fuel to that fire, to the point where you have civilian police departments rolling around with battery rams on armored personnel carriers. What you saw in Ferguson, in many ways, that starts with Daryl Gates. And that creates a framework to understand the drug war. All right, so I hope you all can read this, but Nixon had what we call a Southern strategy. But the interesting thing about the Southern strategy, which kind of turns moderate Democrats to the Republicans, because they basically feel like the Democrats are the party of black and brown people, his epiphany for it came in New Hampshire, a place with very low crime and very low brown people. But this idea of law and order resonated so hard with Nixon in New Hampshire, he said, man, I gotta really hand this up. And so one of the things Nixon realized was that the federal government actually doesn't have a ton of authority over policing. We say it all the time with our police reform conversation. Policing is a state and local issue. Always has been, always will be. So Nixon needed a framework to allow him to be able to claim that he was doing something to really advance the law and order agenda. Drugs are under federal jurisdiction, especially in terms of interstate commerce and international commerce. So you can, if you're Nixon, you're saying I can use the drug war as a way to have legitimate federal authority and control over policing and deliver my base the feeling that we are in control of it. The silent majority is kicking ass, right? No parallels at all to current day, at all. So if you can't read the quote, I'll just try to read it quickly. You want to know what this is really all about. Nixon had two enemies, anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is from John Ehrlichman, counsel and assistant to U.S. President Nixon. So marijuana is really important in that equation. And this is something I didn't know actually until today. This wasn't a done deal. This wasn't something that people accepted. 1972, go to the next slide. Because this actually explains the next slide pretty well. 71, Nixon gives a speech. Drugs are number one enemy, we're at war against them, or silent majority. 72, marijuana is put as a Schedule I drug. Schedule I, worst of the worst, cocaine, heroin, marijuana. People didn't accept that. I was surprised to know this. They were like, marijuana is not as bad as cocaine or heroin. You can just accept your frame. So 8 states decriminalized weed from 73 to 77. His scheduling weed as a Schedule I drug was preliminary. And it really wasn't until the late 80s in the backlash against Jimmy Carter that they were actually able to consolidate this framework. The Senate Judiciary Committee in 77 actually voted to decriminalize possession of a 20 ounce of marijuana. So it wasn't that people accepted that marijuana was this terrible drug because Nixon told them so. But that was just this political inertia that rolled into Reaganism that made marijuana seen as a very illegitimate drug, right? And so you have folks like Daryl Gates, who had an infamous quote that casual drug users should be taken out and shot. Fun fact, Daryl Gates is apparently one of the founders of DARE, that anti-drug program that a lot of you all did in school. That's the guy associated with its founding. So Reagan, again, kind of creates Just Say No, kind of takes this up a notch with his work. And then we obviously get Clinton going into the 90s, Clinton with this kind of new Democrat, tough on crime, but we'll give you some social programs way of thinking. And it just kind of continues to accelerate. Big thing, and I'll say it now, even though it might be on the slide later, from 1990 to 2000, 75% of the increase in incarceration for war on drugs crimes was just marijuana. So to a serious extent, in the 90s, the war on drugs essentially becomes a war on marijuana. And that's going to be important to how we frame our theory of reparations. So let's go to Baltimore. As you can see, this is a map of marijuana arrests in Baltimore, January 13th to October 2014. Marijuana was decriminalized here in the state of Maryland, so this is one of the last data sets of marijuana arrests before decriminalization, and those arrests do decrease. Obviously, you can see some of the geography of where these arrests are concentrated. The west of Midtown, go up to Park Heights, go down to Sandtown, go down to over east, Middle East. You have a smattering of it throughout Northeast, and just this huge absence of marijuana arrests in North Baltimore. All right. Many of you probably know what's coming next, but I'm going to show you anyway. Demographic map of Baltimore City. And you can clearly see where there's the highest concentration of marijuana arrests is the highest concentration of black folks. And this particular map is interesting. We'll hopefully talk about this. Gilmore Homes, where Freddie Gray, of course, lived and unfortunately died, right in the middle of that huge swath of marijuana arrests. Right, so one quick set of facts before we get into this. So ACLU did a report on Baltimore City through 2013, or 2010, black folks and white folks. And this is just something to remember. Black folk and white folk, every credible study says they sell and use drugs at a roughly equal rate. There are a few percentage points of variation here or there, depending on the study. But as a general rule, white folk and black folk sell and use drugs at equal rates. Anybody want to guess how many times more arrests were in Baltimore if you were black for marijuana? 1.6. we totally have a ringer in the audience, all right? The ACLU said you're about 6 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession in Baltimore City if you're black, right? And 62% of those are under the age of 24. 92% of the folks arrested in Baltimore City for marijuana were black. In a city where we're obviously circa 62, 63% of the population. All right, so I just finished reading this book. It's a really important book for how I frame at least a piece of the reparations argument. Right, so Todd Clear, I believe he's at Columbia University. He has a book called Imprisoning Community, and he's been making this argument for a while. And this is part of really a critical argument for the theory of reparations. So, when you lock people up, not only are you not really addressing the problem when it comes to drug sales, because when you lock someone up, all you've done is create a job opening in the drug sale economy. Not addressing the problem of drug sales or drug use, right? But he makes the argument in a very sort of traditional academic statistical way that I think we need for the theory of reparations. That when you take these folks out of community, there is this ripple effect of consequences throughout the community, which actually does more damage to the community, obviously, than drug sales. So when you think about the role that people in the street economy play in their family structures, these folks obviously aren't just selling drugs, they're also taking care of family. They're paying for people to go to school, they're paying for groceries, they're helping to pay rent. Some of you might know that Mondawmin is one of the most profitable malls in the Baltimore area, in the whole state. Not in terms of total revenue, but in terms of pure profit.
Why did you target?
Yeah, that's probably a separate story. But one of the most profitable malls in the state, in part because people pay cash when they go to Mondawmin, right? So you have this series of economic impact, which also have a series of social impacts, where you have the ability for people to lose what he calls the institutions of informal social control, right? So think of Miss Johnson, who sits on the stoop, and she tells the kids to go in the house when the streetlights come on. The more incarceration you have in the neighborhood, the more folks come back hardened from jail, the more disruption you have in the family, the more you have people who have to move from house to house to house, relative to relative, the more folks you have creating sort of antisocial behavior, and that spiral, he makes the argument that creates a spiraling impact on high incarceration communities. A huge percentage of the incarceration we have, it's not spread out, it's like you saw on the map. It's very, very densely packed into very specific zip codes. And there are some zip codes where he makes the argument, I think it's like 1 out of every 5 people, black men of age in the zip code, is in jail. At a moment of peak incarceration in targeted zip codes in places like Cleveland and Baltimore. The ripple impact that has on all the social institutions, the churches, the community groups, the family units, the basketball teams, the institutions you need to have a thriving community, and incidentally, give people an alternative to crime, get ripped to shreds through a hyper-focus on incarceration. And as we know, marijuana arrest has specifically been a huge engine of that mass incarceration. So I'm going to play just a little bit of talk. But before that, I'm going to give you an example of Sandtown, Winchester. You can't see what's on the map, that's fine. I'm going to explain to you what's going on here. So some of you know, in the 90s, Sandtown, Winchester was targeted for hundreds of millions of dollars of investment from the federal government and the philanthropic sector. And it kind of seems counterintuitive that Sandtown was held up in the 90s, that the neighborhood where we're going to prove how we turn it around. Right? And if you actually look at some of the symbols down on that map, I know it's hard to see, but some of those symbols are new housing, some of those symbols are educational opportunities, and some of those symbols are, and I'll give you the exact wording, drug nuisance abatement. That means locking people up. Right? So ironically, and part of the reason why I and others argue this failed, is that while you are pumping money into the community, you are putting more costs in the community to quote-unquote protect your investment. And as Todd Clear points out, it is the engine of incarceration that you rev up in the community when you invest in it from a traditional perspective that helps destroy the community that you try to save. Right, so if the actual investment is Santana that creates the incentive for these type of interactions to happen. Because when you bring in business interests, they want clear corners. They want an end to the open air drug market. They essentially are driving the engine of mass incarceration, which just logically takes away their customers at a fundamental level, but also creates a wave of ancillary social impacts that I argue, and not just me, folks like John Morris, formerly Sojourner Douglas, argue that investment created the conditions that you see before you. That's like Penn North, that helped lead to the uprising. Specifically in that neighborhood that was given all that investment. Because with that investment helped bring even more layers of incarceration, which I think feeds the coercive, because of the coercive mobility hypothesis. You're coercing people into moving to jail. You're coercing people into leaving their neighborhoods. You're destroying their social networks. And you're creating these ripple impacts to help destroy the community. All right? So I'm just going to play a few minutes of a talk. Wait. Can you click on T? Yeah. It's just going to be about 3 or 4 minutes. I know it's not going to be the clearest audio, so I'm just going to try this out and see if we can get it to work. I just want you to hear his argument. It's just try to get people back. It's not fine. That's fine. That's fine. We'll just keep it rolling. That's fine. What's the next one? All right. So. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the coercive mobility hypothesis, kind of what this academic says, but since it's not really wanting to work, I'm just going to summarize kind of my feelings about it. All right. So, positives, the coercive mobility hypothesis, captures the compounding impact of incarceration, shows a theory of harm beyond the temporal limits of marijuana prohibition, right? So that's one of the important things, is that this allows us to make the argument that what happened in the 90s created the framework for us to demand reparations right now. Because when you have this impact on all these other social institutions, that doesn't end even if you stop locking people up for weed, right? You continue to have people who've been through the trauma of these neighborhoods being really decimated. Even if you let people out of jail, you're letting them returning them to communities where the institutions, community institutions that they need to prop themselves up have been decimated by what you did to them, by taking folks out of those communities. So it allows us to make the argument that even if you decriminalize marijuana, until you actually invest in recreating that network of community institutions, you haven't done anything. You're still culpable. Part of his argument is that, and this is, I think, important, there is a drop in crime in America in the 90s and the aughts, right? There's a little uptick now, but generally America has gone through one of the biggest declines in crime over the past 20 some odd years. Why? Obviously, the people who support mass incarceration would say we're locking people up and they can't commit crimes. This theory gives you an alternative way to engage that argument. And at the end of the day, partly where the debate coaches. It says that a lot of the work you see people doing, church groups, things like in Baltimore, the Baltimore ceasefire, reestablishing that network of community institutions can help us understand some of that, a big chunk of that decline in crime. You can't explain it just through the economy. You can't explain it just through incarceration. This is one of the biggest missing chunks to why crime has declined in America. It's an intentional effort of community institutions to kind of make that pivot after Reagan, after that crack epidemic, where a lot of community folks called for locking people up. A lot of community institutions, the churches begin to pivot, 90s, 2000, and you see an impact on crime based on that. All right. Some negatives, some issues I have here. So, back up.
So is this Todd Clear's thesis?
This is Todd Clear's thesis,
Okay.
yeah. So basically, if you would have heard the talk, you would hear him say, man, I would have never thought this would have happened. Back in the 70s, we saw it, no way incarceration would ever go higher. Nobody wanted that. Nobody thought we needed to lock up another 2 million people, but it happened. It was crazy. And to me, and I think some of you in this room, this theory that it's like irrational, that this was irrational policy, ignores that racism makes punitive policy rational. That even if there wasn't a sociological need to jump the American incarceration from 1 million to 2 million to 3 million, a lot of people wanted that to happen because of people wanting to see black people punished. There is a theory of punishment, a racialized theory of punishment, that in this talk, the example is Pancho Villa and the Mexicans, but also the SLA, this theory of black radicalism. People want that punishment. So just pointing out that it may not be rational or needed is not going to make things necessarily better. Second problem I had was that, this is really the biggest thing, is that he makes a lot of arguments that, like, look at the structure. We're trapped in the cycle. Look at these people trapped in the system. And I think that his theory, even though he's trying to like help folks out, really denies agency that black folks have shown in the face of mass incarceration. Right? So he makes arguments that basically go, you can't expect people to have functional family structures in the face of mass incarceration. And I think that a lot of people would say, well, just because you only have one parent doesn't mean that structure can't be functional. And we should see the strengths of folks who were able to function on one income and how the community kind of oftentimes fills in and use that knowledge as the basis point for how we think about the types of communities we want to build after mass incarceration. So I think his theory gets really trapped in trying to basically get black folk off the hook for having communities of high crime by saying they're trapped in the system, as opposed to pointing to all of the cultural and communal innovations that black folks have had in the midst of the war on drugs, right? So we need a theory of reparations, right? Go ahead, go to the next one. Is that complex? So we need a theory of reparations that accounts for something that he can't really capture, right? Is that complex? No, don't worry about it. So this is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So I'll just summarize. She has like a minute quote. And what she is well known for talking about the prison industrial complex and calls herself basically working towards a theory of abolition, right? And some of you probably know there's a basic argument that nothing really good happens in prison. We need to have a radical imagination of the world that we can have that doesn't include the theory of punishment and theory of violence at its core in terms of mass incarceration. So in this clip, the reason I wanted to use it is she talks about an argument we talk about a lot, whereas there are things like maroon communities of folks who fled slavery and folks after the Civil War, who created their whole social systems that didn't include the need for jail. They have alternative ways of dealing with disputes. John Henry Clark talks about African societies whose language didn't have a word for jail in the language, because conceptually they didn't need it, it didn't make sense. The theories of what Todd Clear calls informal social control were embedded into communities in ways that were directly out of an African culture. Some people use the concept of Ubuntu, the phrase "I am because we are," which is distinct from someone like René Descartes, the Eurocentric framework of "I think, therefore I am." So this cultural, this collectivist cultural technology of African peoples, she's arguing we can harness that as a framework for an alternative to the prison industrial complex. So I think coercive mobility does have some good pieces to it. Like if I'm going to a lawmaker, I'm using a lot of Todd Clear's arguments. They talk about just objectively, you're going to make things worse if you do these war on drugs policies. Part of the reason I wanted to bring it up is because when we make our arguments against mandatory minimums, we're using essentially the same argument. This incarceration machine will just drive more incarceration. But we also have this prison abolitionist black culture and agency framework. And so what we do, we're going to mash those two together. Right? Give it again. And we're going to create our theory of community restoration and reparations. Right? So this is kind of the last theoretical portion of it, at least kind of densely theoretical portion of it. And then I'll get into the very specifics of what we want to do. So I realized that we need a theory of reparations, because I was doing this talk and I realized when we use that word, in my brain, I've just kind of naturalized this way I think about reparations. But it's a very specific reason why we've come to these decisions, right? So I wanted to explain our theory of reparations because what we propose won't make sense without it. The reparations are real, not just rhetorical, ideological. Obviously, when people think about reparations, they're thinking reparations for slavery. And there are these entire books, entire speeches, entire theory of reparations that basically says, as a political theory, it's important to advance reparations because it's an ethical way of engaging the world. And we think that argument is true. But we also think that our way of existing in the space of Baltimore is that when we go to the community, they're saying, what can you do for me? How can you feed my family? And we don't want reparations to just be psychological emancipation. We want it also to be a real material way to engage people. So for us, reparations aren't just limited to the conversation on slavery. They're directly related to things that we can actually win materially that improves people's conditions. That relates to the next theory. It's interest conversions, not moral persuasion, is the key. So are folks familiar with this concept of interest conversions? Maybe you've heard the word before. All right, as a professor, he used to teach at Harvard. He's passed on now. He's an elder, ancestor, Derek Bell. He basically makes the argument that even though it's not something we like to think about, a lot of the key victories of the civil rights movement happened because there were powerful white folks who saw it as in their self-interest to grant strategic concessions in critical moments of history. So why does Brown v. Board happen in the 50s? Well, a lot of people don't think about it, the Korean War. The Korean War was a huge thing in the 50s. Thousands of Americans went over to fight in Korea. And they're coming back, and they're saying, I was treated better in Korea than I was treated here in America. So folks that come back, they said the same thing after World War I, World War II, but after Korea, you got a pattern going of very angry black veterans. But you also have an increasingly global media fight between America and the Soviet Union. Cold War zone. So if you're trying to say America is the land of the free, the land of opportunity, global capitalism is the way to go, and you got all these black veterans talking about how racist America is, that's not a good look. You know, and that's just one argument he makes to say that there's just this reality that it is in self-interest for people in power to grant strategic concessions at times. And that's how a lot of black progress has been made. It's not that that progress is invalidated because that's what happened, but we gotta be honest, that's what happened, right? So this is not about just saying we're right. It's not about just saying it's wrong to do this to black communities. It's about us advancing an argument that, look, policymaker from Baltimore County, policymaker from Western Maryland, policymaker from Prince George's County, it's in your interest that black communities in Baltimore are strong and self-sustaining. Because we all do better when these communities are strong. But also, if you don't do what we say, we're going to make your life a living hell. We're going to make it so that you can't get what you want done. We're going to block your bills. We're going to organize the Black Caucus so that they won't let your bill pass unless you do what we say. So interest convergence is a framework for how we do things in Annapolis. But it's also something we push people to think about when we talk about why we do what we do. We have a belief that we can have ways of putting pressure on folks that makes it in their interest to do what we want. And it's not the moral suasion that's key. It's giving them not just a carrot, but also a metaphorical stick if they don't do what we say. All right. Reparations or war on drugs can serve as a proof of concept for more reparations. We need to have an infrastructure for abolition. So just like Bruce Wilson Gilmore talks about, maybe you've heard this term before, abolitionism. I believe in the abolition of the prison industrial complex. You probably see it on Instagram, right? It's become part of showing how radical you are to call yourself an abolitionist. But when we talk about this practically, a lot of folks say, so what do you want to do? What's your program? That sounds good, but how are you going to help me and my family? You know, and instead of saying, you know, oh, we don't have to worry about that argument. We're just morally right. We think in order for us to get to a world of prison abolition, we need an infrastructure for that abolition. We need to show people institutions that work, that give them an insight that the world can be different, so that we can continue to push for the destruction of these institutions that exist. Because, and this is something that's not quite in the talk, you're probably looking at, maybe $50 million a year for marijuana reparations, the tax revenue from legalized weed in Maryland. At the end of the day, that's not a ton of money. But it's important that we get it to go to what we want it to go to, as opposed to whatever it would go to otherwise. So we can show people that this works. Because how much money does the police department get in this city? Around $400 million a year.
Is that too much?
Too much, yes, exactly. That's the big pile of money. But our argument, again, because of interest conversion, is the only way you're going to crack open that piggy bank, the only way you're going to get to defunding the cops, is to show people real institutions that work. And then tell people, if you like that, imagine what we could do with $100 million, $200 million, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the same theory that we use at LBF in our work with the Youth Fund that maybe some of you all heard about. We are creating proofs of concepts for the social institutions that create thriving communities, so we don't need cops in the first place. And that's when the cops will end, when you show people an alternative. All right. Collective repression requires a collective response, right? So this is just our reason why we think of reparations collectively. And we're going to basically argue that that tax money should go to restoring communities. A lot of people think reparations and say, who gets the money? I've seen knockdown, drag out, people crying debates over, I'm part white, do I get slavery reparations? And I think that those are questions that can be had, those are debates that can be had. But from our theory, when people say reparations, we want to shift it from individual reparations to communal reparations, right? So it does relate to the individual who's locked up wrongly for selling weed. But our theory is that if those communities are strong, then all of the people in that community who suffer can get some form of reparation. Not just the individual who got locked up, but the whole circle of people who are impacted by that wrongful arrest can get reparations if we re-establish strong communities. Yeah. So reparation of individuals can only be done by an empowered community. Same thing, right? All right, so the Cole memo. Now we're just going to get to some of the technical stuff about marijuana and the actual policy we're going to push. Cole memo, brought out in 2013, basically under the Obama administration, legalized, gave states a way to sell weed legally, right? So this was not something that went through Congress. It was just something that this guy in the DEA wrote out that said, here's what we're going to do with weed, right? We're going to only really focus on, and you're not going to be able to see it, well, maybe you'll see it. Big thing is make sure that the sale for marijuana doesn't go into the underground. Make sure your legal weed doesn't go to the underground black market. Make sure that none of it's being transported across state lines or related to anything international, right? So even though Jeff Sessions is kind of backtracking on this a little bit, this is essentially the framework that allows weed to be sold legally, right? Marijuana, cannabis, insert preferred term here. So here is the actual technical details of the first two states to legalize weed, Colorado and Washington. They have slightly different ways that they do it. We don't need to go into it, but this is just some idea of, especially for us, the tax structure. So you see, there's really high taxes on legalized weed. So it's a lot of money that's available to be gained. And this is a train that got started in 2012 with the Cole memo. Right? Here is a recent map on the current status of marijuana in America. So as you can see, like medical cannabidiol, thank you, is just a particular form of medicinal THC. It's not like smoking buds, right? But it's medicinal THC. So you can see just how many states have some form of legalized THC or medicinal marijuana. You can see the blue states are states that have legalized adult recreational use, And just a couple days ago, this became out of date because Vermont added itself to the list, right? So this is a wave that's coming to America. That's the point I want you to get from this map, right? And it's a wave that's producing a lot of profit, and that profit is increasing. So just from 2015, you can see this is a projected increase in revenue from marijuana. So we have a lot of medical use, medicinal marijuana, which people sell for profit, but a lot of states don't tax it. Again, the theory is it's medicine, you don't tax medicine. But increasingly, you have more recreational adult use, and that's projected to basically explode to a $15 billion industry in 2021. And those projections are probably conservative. Right, and of course, there's a big problem with that. This is Michelle Vander, author of The Jim Crow, and she is one of the inspirations behind this talk because she makes the argument here are white men supposed to run big marijuana businesses, dreaming of cashing in big money, big business selling weed after 40 years of locking up impoverished black kids for selling weed. Right, so this is one of the things that she started talking about this in 2013-14 that inspired me to think about this. This is just us trying to apply this general theory to the specific circumstances of Baltimore. All right. So this is one of those things that, hold on. We want to talk about very pragmatically. We at LBS want to focus on the tax revenue. And hopefully that's what we lead on. But obviously a lot of people in this room are saying just like that, well, if we got people who sell weed in the black market, how to get them to make money in the legal market? Well, there are a lot of barriers to entry for the marijuana industry, right? Criminal convictions. There are some states that basically it's really hard to get into the industry if you have certain criminal convictions, especially anything that deals with violence, right? And as we know, especially brown people, the DA is going to overcharge you. So even if you weren't violent and how you sold drugs, you might get a second-degree assault just out of general principle, right? And that's actually becoming a barrier for a lot of especially black and brown people getting entry into the business. One quick example, in Olympia, Washington, there was a guy named Louis Johnson, a black guy, bought a building to operate medical marijuana. When they found out about it, the city council condemned the building and put a 1-year moratorium on pot businesses. He's a black guy with a criminal record, right? Juxtapose that to Clark Metcalf, who had 3 run-ins with the law for selling cocaine. One of them, he got pulled over with 5 pounds on him. And as soon as his lawyer got a chance to speak to the DA, they dropped the charges. He's obviously white. And he's running a marijuana business that is actually going to be able to make money in California. So this is just an example of the actual lived experience of how hard it is for black folks to get access to the industry based upon your skin color determining the quality and quantity of the criminal convictions you have, even if you're doing the same stuff. But there's a lot of other stuff going on here. The banking industry. Marijuana is still illegal federally. So if you are a bank, you look at giving a loan to a marijuana entrepreneur and like, oh crap, I might get charged for money laundering. I might get sanctioned by the Trump administration that doesn't like selling weed, apparently. So I'm good on that. I'm not giving loans to y'all, right? So this is something that you can work around by going to state banks that don't have branches in other states. But it's very costly and very cost prohibitive for entrepreneurs that aren't really flush with cash to figure this out, like a lot of our folks, and especially folks who've had marijuana convictions. A few more things, the capital cost. It just costs a lot of money to do this. So even if you have experience selling weed in the underground market, I kind of liken it to like the best pickup basketball players trying to go to the NBA. Like it's a different game, right? And it's important for us to be honest about that and be realistic about the expectations for working class, lower class black folks to make tons of money in this industry. It's not just that there's this level of racism to it. It's just a hard place to make money. You gotta have the money to make the money here. Because you gotta pay for these expensive grow operations. You gotta pay for having connections to growers. A lot of states, when they legalize, say only people with experience can grow your weed. They got to come here to our state and grow weed in this state, but they had to have done it before. So it's only like 3 or 4 states that those folks can come through, and those states don't have a lot of black people in them. So you're like legislating that black folks don't become growers because you're saying they have to have previous experience. So there's just subtle ways that we get frozen out the industry, right? And stuff folks don't think about necessarily, like security. Because the banks are so fidgety about this, there's a lot of cash in this industry, a lot of cash. So you need to have really, really good security. If you are doing a dispensary, even if you're transporting the marijuana from your grow site to your dispensary, when you're processing it, it can be complex and cost prohibitive. And market saturation. So even if we had best black folks with the best weed and the best setups, it wouldn't be the only people selling it. When you legalize, depending on the way you roll out your industry, it's a lot of competition, right? And so I just want folks to be very clear on 2 things. First, this is hard. Second, we're not the experts here. I know a lot, I'm willing to learn more, but I want to be led by minority cannabis entrepreneurs about what they all want to see in that legalization bill and that we can do to help them get going. And we want to focus on the tech stuff. And I think there's some of these folks in the audience that we hope to take leadership from on this front. All right, so 2 scenarios, just to get you thinking about some of the stuff that we think about when we think about this. So let's think about a scenario about all the collateral consequences that come with legalized weed. So this is we call this scenario the status quo. This is the bad way to do legalization. This is what we fear could be coming now. So we got this framework of rich folk who grow weed, right? Looking a lot like that guy. And the thing about it though is that, hit it a couple times, they want to become that. They want to become a monopoly. So even in Annapolis right now, we've had to push and prod them because the people who grow the medicinal weed want to get a literal bill that puts them as a monopoly in the market for 10 years. They want to deny new growers licenses after they expand it just a little bit. They want to then lock it down for 10 years. So this is our concern, that in the status quo, we're heading for this green rush, where this monopoly basically goes to their preferred sellers that look a lot like this guy. You know, just had a conversation a week ago about how all these weed stores look like Apple stores. You know, just the aesthetic and the people who get the money to do it look like that. So they break it down and they get the money. Some of that money goes back to the monopoly and some of it goes to Annapolis, all right? So based upon the advocacy and the work that we've done now, there are 4 buckets of things they're looking to put the money into now. The tax revenue from legalized marijuana sales. And some of them sound good in the abstract, but in our view, we're very concerned about what would happen if this is allowed to go forward. So the first one is, these may be a little small, education. So you got the teacher working with the group of black kids. Who can say no to money for education? But our concern is that what's really going to happen is that the nice white lady's going to get all the money, right? There are very powerful educational interests that are basically seeing this as a trough of money for their nonprofits to get money from, right? Just in terms of who has the power in Annapolis, think PG County, Montgomery County, Howard County, fundamentally. But also, even if it does go to minority or distressed school districts, you're going to look at a lot of folks who aren't like us getting that money. So that's actually the number 1 spot they want to put it, and we have some concerns about that. Spot number 2, workforce development. Now, this is, in theory, good. This is where we want a lot of money to go to in our world. But when you think workforce, you think that black folks in suits, maybe used to be a drug dealer, finally get an opportunity, right? The reality of workforce is not that good, right? Just some of this stuff is basically unpaid internships, free labor for the people they work for. Then you get a certificate that says you have completed the workforce development program of insert X company. They slap you on the butt and say good luck, right? So just saying I'm going to give money to workforce development, which is what they have in the bill now, it's not good enough, right? Because at worst, it's free labor for somebody who don't need it and not valuable experience, right? Another bucket is opioid treatment. So here we have Bubbles, the sympathetic, beloved character in The Wire. Who doesn't want to see Bubbles get clean, right? But the fear is that it's not going to go to get Bubbles clean. It's going to go to get Becky some opioid care, right? You have a huge opioid crisis when opioids hit the suburbs. So when they say opioid money, you're going to be looking at things like methadone or rehab clinics, most likely in the suburbs. That's where a lot of that money is probably going to go. I'm not going to say all of it, but that's our concern, that you're going to have an unequitable distribution of that money for opioid treatment. Last one's kind of funny, but this is in the bill right now. There's concern that when you legalize marijuana, you're going to have people who are high driving. And so like 10% of the revenue goes for anti-high driving education. So they want to spend like $5 million for a statewide anti-driving high campaign. That's what's in the bill right now. And of course, we think that this is ridiculous, right? Most studies on high driving show that it's not a huge risk. People self-police. You have increasingly good tests for it. It's just not a huge concern. Certainly not so central that you write it into the bill at the cost of communities decimated by the war on drugs, right? So that's the green rush scenario. So here is just some theories about how this could work. So let's take this one scenario about how legalization could work. I call this boutique buzz. So this is y-axis is price, x-axis is availability. So you got a lot of availability, a lot of it at the low end, some of it in the high end. That's the status quo. When you have legalization, a market that focuses on boutique weed, you're going to have small availability at the very high end of the spectrum. Maybe a little, this is just one scenario, a little bit in the middle, and the street economy is still going to go on basically as it is. A lot of availability in the street, right? So what happens in this world? So you have high entry barriers, meaning a small amount of high potency, high cost marijuana is available. And not just marijuana, obviously also edibles and vape oil and all that stuff. So high cost keeps the street economy alive, which creates continued arrests for intent to distribute. If you just look at the data, intent to distribute arrests have not declined with decriminalization. And this is part of my concern, is that when you have legalization, the street economy basically means you're taking, the state sees that as these folks in the street are taking tax revenue out of my coffers by selling marijuana on the street. So you may have more people being more aggressively locked up for intent to distribute in a war to legalization, because they want to knock out their street economy so that more people are forced to buy higher cost legalized weed. All right, this is one potential scenario. So this is another one. We call this the weed Walmart scenario, right? Same scenario, lots of stuff in the street. Now you could have a legalization where they have a much bigger pool and variety of legalized marijuana, THC consumables. Much more availability in the legal market so that it's directly competing with the street. So in that world, something you probably see where this is going, there's concern that high volume and legal sales creates pressure on street entrepreneurs. So faced with declining revenue, weed users, weed sellers, supposed to be, shift to other drugs or other forms of street activity, B&E, breaking and entering, auto, etc. So this is another problem, right? Entirely possible that over time, as the market gets saturated, it does compete with the street economy. You know, people just don't want to take the risk of going to their weed man or weed woman. And then you have economic disruption of this industry in Baltimore that has a serious impact on essentially employment in the industry, which creates these collateral consequences of folks shifting. And I've already heard, you know, some anecdotal reports of people thinking about stuff like this in terms of the street economy. So we don't want either of these to happen. We want access to the industry for black and brown folks, and we also want a mechanism to restore those communities so that we don't have to worry about the collateral consequences. So here's what we're fighting for. Again, we're not going to lead on all this, but this is what a good legalization regime looks like, based upon best practices in California, Massachusetts, and other states. Sentencing remission. If white people get it for money, can't keep black folk in jail for it. Folks just want to make money off weed. If white folk get to do it legally, you need to change the sentence of folks who are like sent to jail for intent to distribute. And not only do you change the sentence in the future, you make that change retroactive. So if you were in the past sentenced for selling weed, your sentence is changed to whatever it would be in this new law. So if it used to be 5 years, and now it's 2 years, and you've already served 3, you get out. And California has led the way on this sentencing remission framework for legalization. Automatic expungement for possession charges, right? So California also talks about expungement, like it's not illegal to hold weed anymore. In fact, the state almost wants you to do it so they can get money. So if the state wants you to do it now, why did they punish you for it a couple years ago, right? And not only should you not have that on your jacket, you shouldn't have to go through the hassle of going through the paperwork to get that possession charge expunged. And again, we have to work all this out. The state's going to say they don't have the money to do this. And we may say, okay, we've got this brand new pot of money from legalization, figure it out, right? Prioritize marijuana distribution application from individuals with experience with cannabis, right? So, of course, in our community, the folks who have experience with cannabis are the street entrepreneurs. Not only does that mean they should not be excluded from the industry, they're only folks with experience with marijuana. So they should be preferred when it comes to giving them access to be distributors in the city. Now, growing is complex in a high capital industry. That's not always easy. But being a distributor is something that you can do. And we should have that priority for folks who have experience with marijuana. But in our community, of course, those would be the folks that have jackets, have probably been in jail, right? Oakland's leading the way on this. And again, Oakland has like more kind of autonomy when it comes to registering their businesses. It's like a thing that happens out west. It happens sometimes. So here we may have to make it so that the state can't override the city. Like if the city, like when you apply to be an LLC, I send the information to the state as well, right? So we want to make it so the city can have the authority to prioritize who they want to see sell weed in the city, which could be folks who have past convictions of marijuana. You should get more points for that. If you sign your business and have a community benefits agreement, so you say, I want to come into this neighborhood, but I'm going to work with this neighborhood. I want to have a workforce training program so that people in this neighborhood can get access to jobs in this industry. We should be able to give people more points for that. And so it's just a matter of making sure we write the bill right so that localities can do that. Yeah, so it's important for us, like I said, also to be realistic that this is not easy. The industry itself, I don't think is a panacea. It could be a lot of money being made, but I don't think this is going to be such a huge job creator that the industry itself is going to be able to be revolutionary in terms of its ability to transform our community. Which is why we believe that we, in addition to the jobs in the industry, need to redirect the tax revenue from the nonprofit industrial complex to the community. Because that's really the biggest threat to suck up this tax revenue. Is established nonprofits who can lobby in Annapolis and say, we're the only game in town, we're the safe bet. If you want to look good, give us some of that marijuana money and we'll get you a store in the nightly news. And that's the game that politicians play. I'll give you some money, you get me some social capital so I can run more easily next time. But that's not where we think the money can do the most good. We think it needs to go back to the community. And here are some of the ideas we have for that. So here's an alternative framework, an alternative world we're proposing for. Go back. So you got folks locked up now, right? In this world, obviously, we just said it. Those folks will be free. But not only will they be free, so you have folks who are able to get out of jail, instead of having only folks like this have access to the industry. We want to have diversity of folks have access to the industry. And these are some black female marijuana entrepreneurs all throughout the country who are already leading the charge in terms of equity in the industry, right? So they are able to get the money, and it goes to Annapolis, right? So here's an example of one of the things we'd like to see, right? So you have a grant-making institution. We don't know necessarily what it is, but it's an institution that's in community, and they get the money. Yeah, hit it again. But it's trapped behind bars. So the existing grant-making institutions we have, if they just got the money and we said, do reparations, they wouldn't know what to do. So we want to make it so that we produce a framework that makes it so that whatever institution gets the money can't just give it out to who they like. That there are certain criteria in terms of who gets the money. And here's just one of the most basic examples of the criteria. This is the same map we saw earlier. And the animation didn't come through, but previously I literally circled the neighborhoods that have high concentration of arrests, right? The idea is that, go back. The idea is to make it so that when you determine who gets access to the money, we have it written in a way so that you, not necessarily exclusively, but we prefer people who are from the neighborhoods in green. Not only do we prefer them, we prefer if you lived in the neighborhoods of green during the 90s and the 80s, the periods of the highest enforcement of the war on weed. And we want to see you from that neighborhood, from that community, produce a program that helps restore that community. And it's those folks who have the ability to unlock that money. Right? So that's one of the biggest things we want to do, is to write it in a way so that the folks who have the most organic knowledge of the community and are the most situated within community have the most direct access to that pool of money. Right? So Community Restoration Fund focus on restoring the economic fabric of targeted communities. I wouldn't say just economic. I think it also can be social and should be social as well. That goes right along with the coercive mobility hypothesis, reestablishing these community institutions. Connecting gray market entrepreneurs, so giving them capital and incentivizing cooperation. So then, as some of you probably know, there's just this whole ecosystem of institutions and people making money in the hood that aren't doing it through an LLC. Maybe not declaring it on their taxes, but they're catering, they're doing photography, they're doing graphic design, taking care of people's kids, doing hair, making CDs, selling CDs. John Morris, who I mentioned earlier, did a study on Old Town, and said over the course of like 5 years, $100 million flows through Old Town, not a rich neighborhood. But those neighborhoods are designed to extract money out of the community. Think like a Family Dollar. Every time you go to a Family Dollar, that money is getting sucked up to Family Dollar corporate, and they're sending it over to China where they get all that cheap stuff from, right? These neighborhoods are designed to suck money out of them. We want to use this money to incentivize the types of folks who will circulate money within neighborhoods. So when you give money to these neighborhood entrepreneurs, their social network and their social capital is local. Their market is local within these neighborhoods impacted by the war on weed. And when you give them technical support, when you give them capital, they expand the work they do locally. They hire more people. They're able to do more gigs. They may be able to do more advertising, to get more gigs outside of that geographic area. But because their juice comes locally, their network is local, they're much more likely to stay local. One of the biggest problems, as you all probably know, is that when you get rich black entrepreneurs, they leave the hood. That's part of what happened in Sandtown. It wasn't a total failure, but the people who benefited left Sandtown. Maybe they still stayed in the city, but they left Sandtown. But this Old Town Village model, which is John Morris's model, is specifically designed to keep people situated where they're most needed, in those neighborhoods with a lot of green, a lot of marijuana arrests. Creating alternatives to the street economy. So this is the last point I'll make, and then we'll go to Q&A. I talked about this in the meeting last week. I think about, in my mind, a hypothetical Miss Johnson. And Miss Johnson's an older woman, and she says, I hear you, you can make a good argument, I just don't want my baby selling weed. I just think it's wrong, and I don't want him to sell weed. And part of the argument I think we have to make is that, first of all, we should make the argument that scientifically, weed has been proven to be far less damaging than alcohol. But we should respect people who are somewhat skeptical about this model. And we should say, look, I understand some people use weed as a form of escapism. And we shouldn't want to escape our problem. We shouldn't want to escape white supremacy. But you gotta understand that if we don't do this, they're gonna smoke weed anyway. And then when they legalize it, all of our money is going to leave our communities, go to Annapolis, and get redistributed elsewhere. So you don't want your baby selling weed. He may have to if we don't build alternative institutions here. And we can get this tax revenue build alternatives, economic institutions in the hood so that your baby doesn't have to sell weed, legally or illegally. Because we've built strong economic institutions, not just legal dispensaries, not just those, but other economic institutions in these neighborhoods to create alternatives. So some examples of institutions that are like in the green areas, in the footprint, that'd be eligible to bring in place. Just one example of a community institution. Imagine what they could do with a couple $1 million of operational funds, who they could hire, the economic and cultural impact they could have. Our social club, right? Community institution, been there for decades, desperately needs repairs and renovations, and desperately needs money to incentivize them to be a more of an active part of the community, right? So you incentivize our social club to work with other community institutions and give them the capacity to extend the work they do, to modernize the work they do. But the point is, these are institutions that are in those green areas, not just in the city, not just in black areas, in neighborhoods with high marijuana arrests that we can give money to, that can change those neighborhoods. Red, blacks, and whites. They get money sometimes, but those people are just so brilliant. I'd love to see what they could do with money to do more community programming. What if we had a black community archive and after school classes that play blacks and whites with that cultural perspective, that historical perspective? That's the type of thing that you can see, but you have to have a theory of how to use public policy and give these folks more capacity to do that work. And here's the last thing. So this is a proposal for a workforce development program called You Build, We Build. It's about giving people experience with construction from public housing projects. It's produced by a woman who was 60-something years old, lived in public housing her whole life. And she said, look, I've done these programs, I've administered these programs, but when I tell people the program, they look at me as someone who doesn't deserve money. Even though I live in this neighborhood, I know everybody here, I got the social connections, I got the juice to make it work, but they look at me as a 60-year-old black woman and say, you can't do it. And more than anything else, we actually helped her put together this program proposal. Again, at LBS, adding capacity as researchers to community efforts. But her name is Ms. Catherine, and I can't think of anyone who deserves money to do her program more than Ms. Catherine. And it's the Ms. Catherines of the world that drive us to go to Annapolis and push this policy forward. And it's the Ms. Catherines of the world that can rebuild that network of community institutions to actually create a thriving community in those neighborhoods that have been decimated by the war on weed. So I wanted to end with that, but I just really can't think of a better example of why we're doing this and why this is so important. So yeah, with that.
All right, so if there are folks who would like to ask questions, I'm going to just ask if you could line up over here so that you can use the microphone so that we can capture it on the live feed. So if anyone has any questions, come up. Do you have one? Yeah, yes, that would be somewhere.
And if you all could introduce yourselves as well, just so we know who's in the room and have some idea about maybe where your perspective is coming from, that would be great. Okay, we'll pass the mic.
Okay. So I hope everybody can hear me. Hi, my name is Lauren Proviant, and my professional background is in workforce development. Lawrence, LBLS, I really appreciate your presentation today because this is going to spearhead everything that I have going right now. So again, my background is in workforce development. I work for profit corporations and also for nonprofit corporations. For about the past 2.5 years, I've done some work with a nonprofit technical program based out of Chicago. It's called JART. We're located in Park Heights. And what we do is specialize in teaching people CNC, computer numerical control, and also skills like welding. So I had left JART and in search for something different and of course a different market. And I had done a lot of work in nonprofits with the Mayor's Office of Employment Development, the Maryland Department of Commerce, and so forth, and they drew me into this marijuana industry. So now I am going to be managing and operating a dispensary that will be coming in March 2018. that dispensary's name is called Cannovations MD. So they do not, and like in your presentation, Lawrence, there is not a lot of minority in this business. I am a rare breed. So I want to be sure that when I'm going to my director of operations and to my COO, who are just investors that are not even from Baltimore, and they have no ideas of the barriers that we face and what we need for economical and social impact, is that I take those ideas and data and research, everything that you guys are doing here, and put it together so I am giving back to the community. So again, the name of the dispensary is called Cannovations. Cannovations, Cannavitions. Sorry, it's been a long day, so I hope I spelled it right. But if you go, and if you could, go to that Cannovations website and sign up for our mailing list. And what we'll do is consulting, and what I plan on doing is workforce development. That's actually what I like to focus my dispensary around. When I was at JARC, I placed a lot of people, but the retention was not there. So I did a lot of soft skills. So in my dispensary, I proposed the idea that we're gonna hold soft skills there to empower you, so you'll know what's in your community, you'll know about the market, you'll know how to get into the market, or possibly I can employ you at Cannovations and fight for you. But we have to have data, we have to have a group of people who are standing behind us. I'm working the political end. I'm sure that LBS may be of some help to me, but you guys are crucial, and your participation is crucial in the impact if we truly want to see a result. So again, my name is Lauren. I don't have any business cards with me. I literally just got the opportunity probably about 2 weeks ago. Councilman Christopher Burnett, who's a good friend of mine, had given me this information. We had sat at dinner last night doing a lot of work remotely because the dispensary is still under construction until March. So if you have any questions, please come see me, let me know.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You have a question?
So my name is Charles Rebel. I'm a political science major. This is just an issue that I'm passionate about. I was just wondering, coming up next week, February the 7th, I think it's from 7:30 in the morning to about 5 in the evening, NORML, National Organization for Reform Marijuana Laws, and the Marijuana Policy Project are hosting a Meet Your Legislator Marijuana Legalization Lobby Day. I was wondering if you guys were coordinating with them at all on that.
Yeah. So that raises a really good question. So I'm literally just looking at an email from the folks at MPP and some of the folks at NORML. So we need to have equity, not just in the industry, but also in the advocacy around this issue. And that's actually been some of the concerns that folks have raised around some of these large DC-based national players in the advocacy world. Maybe don't have as much experience in Annapolis, but also have been a little bit reticent about some of the things that we propose here today. Because they want to get something passed so they can go to their bosses and say, we got Maryland done. You know, that's how you advance in the industry and things like that. So we're willing to work with anybody, we're willing to meet with anybody, but we're very clear that the communities that have been most impacted by this issue should be leading around the advocacy around legalization. Because when you have people who don't understand what we laid out today, coercive mobility, a theory of abolition, and how to progressively use tax money, when folks like that control how you write the legislation, you get a bill that doesn't do this. Even if they're really well intentioned, even if they're really smart people, if they don't have experience in how you frame a program that prevents these big nonprofits from coming in and swooping up the money, they're going to come in and swoop up the money. Right? And it's going to be our job not to just push the lawmakers, but also push the advocates. Push the traditional advocacy industry to say, look, welcome to Maryland, welcome to Baltimore. It's communities like ours that have been decimated by the war on drugs. So if you want to lead on this issue, you're going to have to take lead from us. Right? And that's not the way people are typically thought to think about advocacy. They think I'm a smart person, I got a degree in political science, I'm college educated, so I get to talk to legislators, right? Again, we have an advantage in that we're not a nonprofit, and we actually have people in their districts that we can talk to and basically trash you to if you're a lawmaker that doesn't do what we say, which MPP can't quite do. which other folks can't quite do. So it positions us to be able to lead with certain lawmakers in a very particular way. So I look forward to working with MPP and Normal and all those folks, but this advocacy space has been traditionally very white, and it hasn't been seeing social justice as the starting point for its advocacy. It has that more, sometimes libertarian tinge to it, that more do what you want tinge to it. And that's cool, but that also means they don't focus as much on what the tax revenue goes to, because that's not their concern. But for me, that's the core of my concern. And even progressive states like California have made concessions in tax revenue to get more access to the industry. So part of what happened in California, I can't say 100% for sure, is that in order to get things like resentencing, in order to get things like expungements, they gave some of that tax revenue to like cops, right? And that's how the sausage is made sometimes, legislatively. But the devil's in those details. And all I know is I'm not accepting anything don't get Miss Catherine her money. And MPP and Normal better know that.
Thank you. All right, so it looks like you have another.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that they
You
do
want
have, I just wanted to add that they do have a specific chapter just for the state of Maryland where they have a dedicated lobbyist. Their website is marylandcannabispolicy.org, just for anyone that's interested.
All right, so if anybody else has any question, I recognize you, but just come on up. Don't be shy. We want to hear your thoughts and your questions. So, oh, got one. All right. Yep.
Hi, my name is Miguel Buttle. I just moved to Baltimore last month, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about the grant-making bodies. I know that's kind of an unsolved question, but obviously that's really critical here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you step aside from the non-profit industry and the government grant-making industry. Lots of oversight, lots of control. So are there places, maybe Oakland or somewhere else, where some aspect of this has been successful and there are no success factors?
That's an excellent question. In the research, it's hard because a lot of it obviously goes directly to the state, and states are very big and bureaucratic in terms of their funding streams. So in the conversations we've had locally, we've talked about, we have these entities called local management boards, LMBs, here in the state. And they're basically designed to get access to public money, and then they are pass-throughs that send that public money on to nonprofits. The LMBs basically become gatekeepers, right? And whatever framework you use to determine who's the best applicant is who gets the money, right? But those frameworks are typically who's done it before, who has the track record, who's the most proven player. And, you know, our conversations at LBF build on previous conversations. So we've had a whole year of advocacy around this youth fund that we're helping to get off the ground. I actually just signed the memorandum of understanding, I think yesterday. And the whole point of that youth fund was to basically say we have $12 million per year to go to youth. And is it going to go to the same old people, or are we going to actually use a equity framework, a cultural framework, a framework that focuses on building the capacity of communities to distribute that money? So we actually had a whole advocacy campaign where we basically did, for the youth fund, what we're trying to do for marijuana. We had some established nonprofit players come into the space. We really demanded our space in that space, and we were able to get our CEO to be the co-chair of the task force that designed the recommendations for the youth fund. And that youth fund is going to focus on capacity building for grassroots institutions in Baltimore that traditionally haven't gotten money, which is very different than how people normally think of grant making, right? So again, the youth fund is like almost a proof of concept for the marijuana reparations stuff, right? And we're trying to create a new epistemology, a new way of thinking about this space. It typically hasn't been public. It's been through philanthropy. Problem with philanthropy is structurally not accountable to community. I can't vote out the person on the board at the Annie Casey Foundation. I can't roll up on the person who runs OSF and say, what was that shit you did yesterday, right? I mean, I could, but I end up in jail afterwards. And that's the reality. It's like, the public sector is not a panacea, but it's at least structurally accountable to elections and public pressure in a way that philanthropy hasn't been. So even progressive philanthropy at times can fall into spaces that don't really honor what community has to offer. Like, you know, the local LMB may not value Ms. Catherine, nor might Annie Casey Foundation, because again, she doesn't fit the archetype of who they're looking to fund. That maybe not have a college degree, maybe doesn't have a huge infrastructure to like track the money and do the accounting. Could do it. I mean, she sat me down for 3 hours and told me to write that 20-page proposal. She gave me every detail. So she has an incredibly sharp mind, an incredibly specific vision of what she wants to do. But because of the way it's been socialized in our society, people like Ms. Catherine are presented as an archetype of who deserves investment. We talk about soft skills. I trust her to give soft skills to people or to know how to communicate those soft skills to people. I always think about, you know, they say when you come out of jail, some people have to learn how to smile again, right? And that's like deep. And you need someone who actually has a deep connection to that person to make them accept that way of thinking, right? Because like maybe I don't want to smile for you. Maybe I don't want to do service economy work. Maybe I want to be an entrepreneur. Or maybe I just don't want to learn it from you, right? And you need to account for that as opposed to pathologizing that person. Design institutions that account for that reality and respond accordingly. And that's what we're trying to do here.
All right.
Local management board. So different localities and jurisdictions throughout the state. They call them different things in different states. Here in Maryland, we tend to call them local management boards. This is just like a sort of a semi-public entity. It's almost like a public foundation. Here, ours is called the Family League. And we've had a couple of years of beefing with the Family League. That basically has made a lot of the arguments I've made here, in general, very specifically towards them, right? And that's not to say they're bad people, it's just that they come at it from a certain perspective of what best practices are. And we just don't think that perspective is true. Like, we have a lot of data and theory and just empirical proof that the way you're doing it ain't been working. Let's try something different.
All right, so we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions outside of this sister. So if anybody else is interested in asking a question, please come on up. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, my question is about, have you looked at history? Because this reminds me of the lottery when it started in '76.
Yeah.
That money was supposed to go to education, and now I'm seeing that the schools are cold and Howard County gets great, you know, marks and things like that. So what are the lessons that we can learn from that?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And it's not one I have an easy answer to. There's one thing about designing this program. There's another thing about enforcing the design. Because what happened with some of that lottery money was that, at least especially the local casino money, and I think they make the same argument for the lottery money, was that it did go to schools. But because they had more money in the lottery pot, they cut back the money from the other pot. So they did send that money to schools, but because they cut back the money in the other pots, the funding remained basically flat. And that's the insidious thing about policymaking. Is that when you squeeze the balloon at one end, maybe it inflates over here, but it deflates over here.
But
right?
it doesn't take away from the neighborhoods, the money being sucked out of the neighborhoods by the lottery,
Exactly.
where money's going back in.
Exactly.
And that's what I would like to see,
Exactly.
is that if this money is, you know, marijuana money is coming out of these neighborhoods, then it gets poured back in at an equal ratio.
Exactly. Back in the day when we had Little Willie running those numbers, it wasn't perfect, but he actually hired people from the community. Right? And that's what we need to bring back. Who's the Little Willie today? Right? And how can we give them an infusion of capital so that they have an incentive to build businesses locally, to do that entrepreneurship locally. Little Willie today might be in the underground economy, selling drugs. Right? So can we have a framework that restores that network of social institutions that helps give you some alternative to the current situation? And the big thing is that it's going to have to go locally. And in the actual piece I wrote on the website, please check out our website, lbsbaltimore.com. Lots of great things for you to look at, including you can sign up to be a sustainer for our organization. We really appreciate it. Low as $2 a month. But on the website, one of the things I said was that there needs to be what you could call a clawback provision, which is just what it sounds like. The state law should say you give priority to people who can prove they lived in this neighborhood during the periods of highest enforcement of marijuana prohibition. You give them like heckle points. The great thing about that is you don't have to say, give it to black people. Because these neighborhoods are so segregated, that did the work for us, right? So the intent is these folks have local knowledge. You give them priority in terms of if Ms. Catherine has the RFP, the proposal, she's preferred over the person who went to Harvard and then parachuted into Baltimore. And if you don't do that, we get to take the money away from you. That needs to be in the bill, but like you said, they won't do it unless we make them do it. So it's always a question of having the community support to put the pressure to enforce the bill. And that's typically where sometimes we fall short. We get the bill signed and we celebrate and we think that we've won. But it's the continual pressure and the enforcement that makes the bill turn into something more than just a piece of paper. And that's the hard part. It's not going to be easy. But fortunately, I think we're right. I think this is a really good idea. Objectively, this is good for people. And Maryland's 30% black, 35% black. There can be a lot of pressure applied to these folks. Our state feels really messed up. In some ways, we're actually pretty well situated structurally to annoy the hell out of these folks in Annapolis, right? And so I don't think it's going to be easy. But I think there's an interest convergence happening where to pass this bill, they need to do something that looks like social justice. They don't really care if it's social justice, it just has to look like social justice. And unlike in previous years, I think we can give them something that looks like social justice that actually is social justice. And then we can push them, hopefully before they understand what we're really trying to do here. Or maybe they, are willing to accept, like, a strong Baltimore is good for the whole state. We just have to win that it's Ms. Catherine that makes a strong Baltimore. That's what they don't believe. And if we can show them the coercive, the Todd Clear stuff, we can show them the Wilson Gilmore stuff, we can show them that these are folks uniquely situated to address the history of violence, of state violence in these communities. They're going to have a hard time giving it to anyone besides what we say. And that's the work we have to do. That's the argument we have to win. And that's the pressure we have to apply to this done.
Can we give one more round of applause to Lawrence Benton?
We got our final question. That was a little
preemptive of a clap.
It's a quick question, and that's like, tell us a little bit about the time frame for this and what's happened when you've had conversations with people in Annapolis or people in power. That would be helpful.
Yeah, that's the big thing. This isn't theoretical. This isn't just a good idea. Our Director of Public Policy, Dave Love, is in Annapolis probably 3 times a week talking to lawmakers. So they just rolled out medicinal marijuana here in Maryland. The general feeling is that we need a couple years, at least 1 year, to figure out what's going on, right? So even if they pass a bill, it will be for a referendum in 2020 that will actually bring legalized marijuana to the state. So either way, we're looking at a few years to really ramp up the advocacy to get this through. I think one of the biggest threats is people will be so excited about legalization that they'll write a bill that's very vague and allow the nonprofit industrial complex to fill in the blanks, right? We don't know if this bill is going to pass this session. It is going to get in. I don't think it's going to pass. We are having conversations with folks explicitly around this provision about reparations and community restoration. There needs to be other folks that lead the conversation around resentencing, expungement, and minority participation. We want to help, we want to provide research, but we don't think we can lead on everything. And so the theory is that with medicinal marijuana still kind of shaking out, it may not get through this year, but we're going to have to be very vigilant about what comes through. I'm more afraid of it actually coming to a vote this year, because if it gets passed this year, that just gives folks who aren't thinking like this more time to gear up and really start licking their chops when it comes to that pool of tax revenue. So we don't know. Please go to our website and sign up for our email updates. We really need folks to stay abreast of this. Call your lawmakers if they are trying to give your money away to someone who's not the community. If they're trying to write bad bills that leave space for the nonprofit industrial complex to come in and not taking leadership from the community. Because again, we get so excited about the prospect of legalization, we sometimes miss these really pivotal details. And this is all about the details. So it's coming through right now because they didn't roll out medicinal marijuana in the right equitable way. They're trying to do something that makes people feel better about what they did with the growers for medicinal marijuana. And that could be putting a legalization referendum in the pipe for 2020. Right, so it's possible. The biggest thing is that we stay vigilant and not allow them to sell us on something that, again, looks like social justice, but it's really just kind of slapped together so they can look like they're doing something. And I think if we're vigilant, they're gonna have a hard time selling anything other than a legitimate bill as something they can see as a win. So it's definitely a fluid situation. We got to stay up on it. So again, please go to our website if you can. If you can't give money, please just sign up for the email updates. If you can't give money, that'd be great. But I mean, like I said, this is something that's very, very much on the agenda right now. So we're going to Annapolis talking about this right now.
So I just want to thank you all for coming out to 2018's first Malcolm X Talk with LBS. Lauren's already dropped the plug many times, but for those of you who are not a sustainer, the way in which we are able to make these sort of radical arguments and do the work that we do without having to capitulate to organizations is by getting funding from our base of folks who we are held accountable by. So if you are not a sustainer, we implore you to go to the website, lbsbaltimore.com. There's a link to donate. You can be a one-time donator or you can donate on a monthly basis as low as $2 a month. It's like Hulu or Netflix. I know most of y'all got accounts, you know, a couple dollars a month can help us do this work. It goes a long way. Sign up for the email list if you haven't. Also on Thursday, we're having our first Black Power Happy Hour for 2018. So come, drink with us, talk with us, ask more questions, and meet more like-minded people. Thank y'all again. I'm Lady Bree. Y'all have a good night.
Location and time.
Oh, the location and time for the happy hour. Flight Fusion Restaurant on York Road. You should look us up on Facebook. There's more information there. And it's at 677. I lied. All right. Have a good night, folks. Be safe. Be warm.